The Stonewall riots of 1969, also leading to the current day pride parades that we have nowadays. Marsha P. Johnson, a activist that was essential to gay rights for over 25 years. Harvey Milk, he was the first gay governor to be elected to San Francisco, was also assassinated 1 year after his election. And Audre Lorde, a lesbian activist and poet. So you guys may or may not have heard of any of those figures or events, but LGBTQ plus history is already extremely, education in history is already extremely limited. And I will be doing my presentation on the politics of queer education and visibility, because for many queer youth, this is extremely important. So on March 28th, 2022, Ron DeSantis of Florida signed the Parental Rights in Education, or what many people call the Don't Say Gay bill. So this bill basically allows parents to control what their child is being taught, but unfortunately it targets discussions on sexual orientation and gender identity from grades K through 3 and wherever else it's deemed inappropriate. There is another portion of the bill that talks about health services and information, but I will just be covering the educational aspect. So examining the support behind the anti-LGBTQ plus education bill, FEAR. So in lines 7 through 9, we see that this bill states to reinforce the fundamental right of parents to make decisions regarding the upbringing and control of their child in a specified manner. And one of the leading reasons to support this bill is because many of these people are fearful that their child is going to be indoctrinated when they learn about LGBTQ plus education. There's kind of this narrative that goes around that queerness is somehow infectious to vulnerable minds, to children, and that their exposure to it early on will somehow affect their likelihood of developing into a gay individual. And since this is the same group of people that stigmatizes LGBTQ plus individuals, they do not want their child to turn into this type of person. So in turn, they have sought out means to control what their child is being exposed to, which in this case, it's preventing LGBTQ plus education, right, to protect their child because of their fear of their child being indoctrinated. Furthermore, talking about LGBTQ plus history and education also threatens heteronormative society. So a heteronormative society consists of people that are straight and cisgendered. They are the majority in the world and are what are featured basically on films, media, books. They're considered the standard and everyone else is considered an outsider. So by bringing up discussions about LGBTQ plus struggles and teaching about their history and education, there is fear in, because it's a threat to the heteronormative society. When you bring up minority issues, it threatens the power and the privilege that the majority group holds currently. Furthermore, I just wanted to talk about how this is an example that LGBTQ plus education would be a privilege. It shouldn't be a privilege, but everything else that is talked about, like heterosexual, sexual health and relationships, is all considered the norm, and the fact that LGBTQ plus education is even debated shows that the heteronormative majority is what holds the privilege in the world. Furthermore, it's also important to point out that many people who had supported this bill were religious Republicans. Okay, so moving on. So in the same lines, we see that having control is power. So heteronormativity is defined as a societal hierarchical system that privileges and sanctions individuals based on presumed binaries of gender and sexuality. As a system, it defines and enforces beliefs and practices about what is normal in everyday life. So this basically is what kind of classifies someone as being part of the in-group and out-group when it comes to sexuality and gender. So of course, since straight and cisgendered people are considered the in-group, anyone who falls out of that is subject to being discriminated against or ostracized in a society where they are not considered normal. So being able to prevent their children from learning about this keeps that type of majority group in control. By keeping their children ignorant, they also are letting the their children remain powerless, because education is a tool, and if their children were to be taught about this, their children could then help demolish the heteronormative society and homophobic and transphobic types of behavior that exist. So by preventing them from learning about it, they are also kind of keeping their own power and their own control in place as well. LGBTQ plus education requires relearning, and it requires redefining what is normal. So for many people who have biased and prejudiced perspectives, getting out of that takes a lot of exposure and repetition, and education is a great tool for that. But preventing that allows children to kind of grow up and accept their bias and prejudice, either beliefs that they got from their parents or others. So allowing ignorance for their children is actively choosing to ignore other perspectives that threaten to dismantle heteronormative regimes. So some consequences. So this bill really attacks the visibility of queer youth, and it reinforces the othering of queer individuals with homophobia and transphobic behavior. So this bill targets instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity. And by shunning these topics of queerness and not letting it be taught about, it basically reinforces the othering concept and allows for the continuation of the belief that queerness is considered abnormal and unnatural. It also allows for stereotypes to exist in society, because when it's not being talked about, it allows them to persist instead of being demolished instead. Biases and ignorances are not simply innocent passive acts of unknowingness. They must be contested through the laborious process of unlearning, and preventing this learning process just allows for these stereotypes to furthermore exist in society, which are extremely harmful to queer youth. This bill also protects the heteronormative narrative that classifies heterosexuality as the default. It also protects binary genders as the standard, which we had just talked about. So instead of preventing prejudice attitudes, the bill goes to support the development of them. This perception and the lack of policies to combat heterosexist bias functions to reaffirm the identity of the child that cringes, oppresses, and ignores the other. So education is a great tool to kind of attack biases and prejudice behaviors against others, but by not having this education in place, it allows for children to kind of adhere to those prejudices that society teaches in the heteronormative society, and allows for their behavior to go kind of unpunished and unchanged as a result. So the lack of visibility, it also, of course, has consequences on queer youth. This bill also seeks to prohibit classroom discussion and sexual orientation and gender identity. So discussion is vital to minorities because it serves as an open space for queer individuals to kind of feel heard and validated as a group of, as people that are often ostracized in society. And it's essential to make progress. So without the direct involvement of education and support from educational leaders, it's impossible to produce a new space where dialogue and change towards a more safe and inclusive culture can actually happen. So unfortunately, this bill is very consequential to queer youth. It also reinforces the tabooness of LGBTQ plus studies by not letting it be talked about. LGBTQ plus education is a tool that gives queer youth a sense of validation and works to kind of combat homophobic tendencies they may have against themselves in a society where they are oftentimes ostracized and considered abnormal. So this inclusiveness that occurs by discussing it is really important, and unfortunately this bill attacks that. So I'm just going to conclude by saying that education is exposure, and unfortunately this bill harms the progression of society that accepts LGBTQ plus individuals. Education breaks the stigma and the silence, and without it, LGBTQ plus individuals will continue to suffer. So education is super important in minority groups, and it brings light to many issues and gives minority groups a platform to be able to talk about their struggles and issues. Without exposure, there is no progression. And without progression, marginalization and victimization of LGBTQ plus individuals will continue to occur as long as the silence that sustains heteronormativity is not disrupted. So this is my works cited page, and thank you for listening.